There is a specific smell to an old bicycle. It's a mix of oxidized steel, dried leather, and a scent I can only describe as time. Most modern shops won't touch these. They'll tell you it's obsolete. They'll tell you the parts don't exist. But our grandparents knew something we've forgotten. They knew that steel has a memory, and that a machine built with hands can be healed by hands. Today, we're going through 25 illegal restoration tricks, unconventional, old school, and sometimes controversial, that still work today. 1. The cone stem time bomb. Many European bikes from the 60s through the 80s didn't use the flat wedge design we see today. They used an expanding cone wedge. To make these, the alloy had to be bent during manufacturing, which created invisible stress cracks over decades. Your grandfather might have looked at a pristine-looking French stem and decided to swap it for a Japanese wedge style anyway. Why? Because in the old days, rideability always trumped originality. If the metal is tired, you don't preserve it. You replace it. 2. The glass fossil German green grease. If you open up a German bike from the 1940s or 50s, you might find something that looks like emerald jewelry inside the bearings. It's a specific green grease compound. But don't be fooled. Over 70 years, this doesn't just dry out. It crystallizes into something closer to hardened epoxy. Our grandparents knew you couldn't just add more oil to this. It's a chemical time capsule that has to be chiseled out before you can even see the bearings. 3. The bottom bracket chisel. When grease sits for 40 years, it stops being a lubricant and starts being tar. Sometimes even the best oversized wrench won't budge a vintage cup and cone bottom bracket. The illegal trick. You don't use a bigger wrench. You use a literal chisel. You carefully chip away the first layer of oxidized, hardened crust just to expose the metal underneath so your tools can finally get a grip. It sounds violent, but for a seized vintage frame, it's often the only way. 4. The scavenger's path. French threading. French bikes are beautiful, but they are a trap. They used proprietary threading that is now essentially extinct. If your bottom bracket is shot, no amount of money can buy a new one at a modern shop. The illegal trick isn't a repair, it's a hunt. Old school restorers know that the only fix is to find another discarded French frame and scavenge the unit. It's a survivalist's approach to mechanics. 5. Sacrificing the pin cotter pins hold the crank arms on older bikes. They are notorious for seizing. You could spend 3 days with a drift and a hammer trying to save a 50-year-old pin, but you'll probably just mushroom the head and damage the crank arm. The grandparents' trick: cut straight through it. You sacrifice the $2 pin to save the irreplaceable crank arm. It feels like a defeat, but it's actually a strategic victory. 6. The oil trap. We've been taught that grease is always better for bearings, but if you have an old Sturmey Archer 3-speed hub, grease is the enemy. These were engineered for light oil. If you pack them with modern thick grease, the shifting mechanism gums up and fails. Our grandparents kept a small oil can in the garage for a reason. Sometimes the primitive solution is the only one that works. 7. The coaster brake cook-off. Old-timers knew the limits of their materials. Classic brown axle grease was the standard, but it had a melt point. If you rode a coaster brake bike down a long hill, the friction heat would actually cook the grease, leaving the brakes dry at the moment you needed them most. The trick wasn't better grease, it was knowing when to stop and let the hubs cool down. It's a slower way of living. 8. Reading the metal. You can tell more about a bike's quality from its brakes than its paint. Center pull brakes with that iconic wire yoke represent an era of engineering focused on power distribution. The single pivot side pulls that came later were often just a way to cut costs. Our grandparents could grade a bike just by looking at the architecture of the calipers. They knew when a bike was built to last and when it was built to sell. 9. The breathing steel modern carbon and aluminum are brittle. If you bend them, they snap. But vintage steel has ductility. If you want to put a modern wide wheel into an old frame, you can literally stretch the steel dropouts, a process called cold setting. It's the illegal art of forcing the frame to accept a future it wasn't built for. 10. The loose bearing upgrade. Most people think replacing loose balls with a caged bearing assembly is an upgrade. It's actually the opposite. Old school mechanics would throw away the cages and pack the hub with loose ball bearings. Why? Because loose bearings, when properly packed, spin much freer than caged ones. It's a small, hidden trick that makes a bike feel like it's floating. 11. The vinegar bath. Before the era of high-tech rust removers, there was the pantry. A rusted derailleur doesn't need a sandblaster, it needs patience. Submerging steel parts in white vinegar for 24 hours eats the oxide without harming the base metal. It's slow, it smells like a salad, but it's a gentle way to respect the original finish. 12. Aluminum foil and water. This sounds like a life hack that shouldn't work, but it's a staple for chrome restoration. If you have light pitting on a chrome handlebar, you don't use sandpaper. You crumple up aluminum foil, dip it in water, and rub. The foil is softer than the chrome but harder than the rust. It creates a chemical polishing paste that leaves the chrome shining like it's 1965 again. 13. The leather reset. A Brooks leather saddle that's hard as a rock isn't dead. Our grandparents would sometimes soak the leather in lukewarm water for an hour, then ride it for a few miles while damp. The leather remembers the shape of the rider. You apply a bit of tallow or proofide afterward, and you've given a piece of skin a second life. 14. Steel wool. Dry scrub. For heavy rust on steel rims, 0000 grade steel wool is the surgical tool of the workshop. You don't use water, you scrub dry. It feels like you're doing nothing until suddenly the brown haze lifts and the steel reappears. It's a meditative process. It's the sound of the metal coming back to life. 15. The paraffin wax dip. Long before ceramic coatings, people boiled their chains in paraffin wax. You melt the wax in a double boiler, drop the clean chain in, and let it soak into every link. When it cools, it's dry to the touch and won't attract grit. It's the cleanest a drivetrain will ever be. It's a ritual of fire and wax. 16. Boiled linseed oil. Rust starts from the inside. Steel frames are hollow, and moisture finds its way in. The old school preventative? Pouring a bit of boiled linseed oil inside the tubes, plugging the holes, and rotating the frame until every internal surface is coated. The oil dries into a hard, protective skin. It's an invisible shield. 17. Sanding the pads. Old brake pads get glazed. The surface turns into a hard, plastic-like slick that won't stop the bike. Instead of throwing them away, you take a bit of 80 grit sandpaper and take off the top ½ millimeter. You're looking for the soft, grippy rubber underneath. It's a 2-minute fix that saves a vintage component. 18. The Tink test. You don't need a digital tensiometer to true a wheel. You need a screwdriver and an ear. You tap the spokes. Each one should sing a note. If a spoke goes thud, it's loose. If it's a high ping, it's too tight. You tune a wheel like you tune a guitar. It's about harmony, not just measurement. 19. The hammer as a scalpel. A hammer is often seen as a tool of destruction, but in vintage restoration, a light tapping can break the surface tension of a seized bolt. It's not about force, it's about vibration. You're waking up the metal. It's a conversation between the hammer and the rust. 20. Beeswax threads. Modern Loctite is great, but it's permanent. Our grandparents used beeswax on screw threads. It provides enough friction to keep the bolt from vibrating loose, but it also acts as a lubricant and a moisture barrier, so the bolt will actually come out 20 years from now. It's thinking of the next person who will own the bike.